Welcome back to the visual novel series. Previously, we had left off where we completed our character management system, which entailed having us make a way for the character to speak, as well as move around. Now, today we'll be focusing on a different topic, which is actually changing the appearance of our character through what will be called the body layer and expression layer transitions. We'll have two ways of going about doing this: a transition, as you might imagine, a gradual change to a different image or sprite, and then we'll also have setting, which is instant. So let's dive right into it. First of all, one thing you'll notice over here in my characters, I only have Raylene. I removed the others, which were single layer characters, because the type of character that I'm going for in this visual novel is strictly multi-layer. Of course, this isn't actually going to be something I'm going to be releasing. These aren't even my characters, but just for the demonstration purposes, what I'm sticking with is a multi-layer character. So here, let's talk about how to actually fetch the sprites that we want to use. Now, if you have a single image with many sprites like this, and you split it up into each individual one, then what you're going to have is a single texture file with multiple sprites associated with it. But how do we actually go about loading a sprite from a texture file? We'll be doing this using resources like we've done with everything else. Or actually, have we even used resources yet? Anyway, before I digress too much, let me get back on topic. What we have here is I have 4 body sprites that are in this image. Now, one thing you'll notice, if you click on one of these sprites and then come up to the inspector view, where we have the name of the image, it shows the name of the actual texture file, followed by an underscore and an integer. That integer is the index of the sprite within the array that can be gathered from this texture. So if we convert this texture into a sprite array and they get index 0, then we'll be returned this body. If we look for index 3, then we would go over here to get Raylene at an angled pose with her fingers crossed. Looks like she's twiddling her fingers a little bit. That will be index 3, which is actually the 4th image in the texture. All the way down here is 23, meaning we have 24 total sprites that we can take from this single texture file. If this isn't how you're doing it, and you're importing each of these images as their own texture, and then import those textures as sprites, then all you'll be doing is loading a single sprite from the resources following the name of that specific file. First off, since my character here is just an image and I'm not going to have multiple textures for each one, I don't actually have to have Raylene in her own folder here. That'll actually help me out with simplicity, so I'm just going to move Raylene into the characters folder and then delete her directory. And that presents me with the opportunity of just loading a character from the characters folder. So now, where I have PC Sakura Fantasy Chapter 1 Raylene.png, I'm just going to change that to the character name, which is Raylene. So the texture is now Raylene.png, so literally if I want the textures associated with this character, I just look up inside the character folders the texture by the name of the character. And now let's jump into the character script and start coding. Now, for organization, what I'm actually going to do here is just make a little sandwich zone saying this is where I begin transitioning. So begin transitioning my images. There, so now we have our little sandwich area. And the way we want to do this is, first of all, before we go setting anything, we want to be able to retrieve the sprite. Now, as I said, the sprite is associated with an index inside of the texture file, if you're doing it this way. So if I want to load Raylene, if I say I like this pose, I like her at that angle with the hand on the hip, then I need to just look at the file name and say, okay, that's index 2, so what I want to do is load the sprite at index 2 after I get the array from this texture. So let's make a function here called getSprite, which will take an integer, and we'll call it index. By default, it'll equal 0. Now, the way we're going to get the sprite array from a texture file, like I said, we'll be using resources. So let's make a little sprite array that we can store the result in. Set it to equal resources.loadAll. And make sure to cast each object that's being loaded as a sprite. And then the path, since we're loading from resources, that will just be, let's take a look at that real quick. That will be resources, images, characters. So I will be loading images dash characters dash character name. And that will get us all of the sprites in that texture. So what we'll then do is return the sprite based on whatever index we wanted to get. Return sprites index. I don't know why I called it indexer, a little typo there. There we go, sprites index. And just so we can see this working, I'm actually going to make a little debug.log area right here and just print the length of the sprites array. There we go. So now inside of character testing, after Raylene is created, we're going to run that. So Raylene.getSprite index of 3. Wait, no, 2, because that's the one that had her hand on her hip, like we were talking about earlier. There we go. So immediately after she's created, we're going to get all the sprites and then print the number of sprites. Let's play and watch this work. There we go, and our console has now printed the number 24, which is exactly the number of sprites in that character. So we know that works. Now, maybe I don't want to do it by index all the time. That seems a little complicated. For instance, if you have multiple characters, just like Raylene, if all your characters use the same postures, like each one is going to have a front, let's call it normal, and they'll also have a front, looks like shy. Then they'll have angle normal, angle shy, I guess. So if we know that all characters share those same expressions, then we know that 0, 1, 2, and 3 all equal the same image for every character. So what we can instead do is associate an index with a name value. And there you could say that 0 equals normal, so instead of loading integer 0, you could load normal, which would actually equal the integer 0, and that would just make things easier for you. But you would have to define those in an area that you would like to do that. I'm not going to worry about that because it's not that big a deal for me, and I can just come inside the image and see whatever I want right off the bat, and I don't mind doing that. So let's just go with what we have here. So now we have successfully gotten the sprite at a certain index. Now what we need to do is actually set the sprite. So we have two different layers. This is a multi-layer character, so we have a renderer for the body and the expression, which means I need to have a function to change the body and the expression. You could use a function to change them both, depending on whatever parameters you pass in. You could use a reference parameter. It's all up to you. For my taste, I'm actually going to make two separate functions. That's just the way I'm going to do it. Keep it organized like that, and I don't feel like messing around with a whole bunch of variables. So public void set body. I already know I'm setting an image, so I don't need to add image on that name. And this will just take an index, because what we're going to do is get our sprite called sprite equals get sprite of index. And since we have our sprite, we know that our body renderer is going to need to set this sprite as the active sprite. So instead of just storing that, I don't even need to do that. I'll say renderers.bodyRenderer. So renderers.bodyRenderer.sprite equals getSprite at that index. Alternatively, maybe I'm not going to pass in an index. Maybe I already know the sprite that I'm going to use. So I'll want an option for that on the side. We'll do that by making a function of the exact same name, so that way it's just a different type, and say sprite instead. And there will be I'm going to need to call right here renderers.bodyRenderer.sprite equals sprite. So I can set it that way. I can just copy this and duplicate it for the expression, calling it now, instead of set body, set expression. If you have many layers to your character, it might be in your best interest to do what I talked about first, setting up one function for either one, and then just passing in a reference to the renderer, so that way you don't have to have a whole bunch of functions for each layer. And there we go, now we have the ability to set our body and expression sprites. So, real quick, within our character testing, I know I can get pretty repetitive with this testing stuff, but hey, let's just roll with me. So first of all, I'm going to want to know what index I want to change to, and just say public integer body index expression index equals 0. Now if I press the key of B, then I'm going to change the body. Alternatively, I can press the E key to change the expression by saying set expression to our expression index. Alright, so let's take a look at Raylene. What do I want to change her to? I'm going to move her to the angle where she has her hands joined together, so that will be index 3 for the body. So body index 3. And then that looks like a good expression there, so 15. Again, maybe having names associated with these would help out, but only if all of your characters are going to use the same types in the same order. Now let's change the body with B. There we go, we have changed the body, and let's change the expression. And yes, that was a very hardly noticeable change, but it changed nonetheless. Alright, so there is our instantaneous setting of the character, but now we need to do transitions. So let's head back into the character script, and in here, of course you probably already know where I'm going with this. We're going to be using a coroutine to handle the transition, since it's something that's going to be happening over time. Now, one thing though, the transition between these images, we're not actually going to handle that within the character class, because that's something that we can use not only for characters, but for backgrounds, foregrounds, and any other type of transition that uses images and sprites. Let's go back into Unity, and in our scripts, I'm going to handle this through something called global functions, which is a new class I'm going to create, global F for functions. I'll just open this up, and this is going to be a class that will have a whole bunch of static functions that can be used by pretty much any class, instead of having to incorporate whatever detail that might be inside the actual base code of that class. Global functions, here we are. And now what we're going to do is create our transition function. It will have a boolean return, because that boolean will represent whether any value has changed this go around or not. Transition images. Okay, now the way we use these values is important, because we don't just want to pass in values, we want to pass in the variables, the storage containers for those values, so that way we can change them directly. And we'll do that using the reference keyword. So reference an image, which will be our active image, which reminds me, we're going to want to use the Unity Engine namespace. So using unityengine.ui, the UI namespace rather. And instead of image position, I can now say image, and this will be active image, and then we're going to reference a list of all images, which will include all images that should become inactive, as well as the active image itself. And this is going to be created in the character class, and we'll just be passing it through into this transition image function. So all images. We also want to know the speed of the transition. We'll handle that through a float, and whether the transition is going to be smooth or not. Right off the bat, let's create a value called anyValueChanged and set it to false, because it's only going to change to true if a transition takes place. At the very end, we just return any value changed. Now let's go back into the character script before I forget to do this, and we need to make the holders for all of the renderers associated with this object. We know that body renderer is the active renderer, but we need a reference for all the other renderers that may be attached to this character that are currently rendering out. We'll do this through a list of images, and we'll call this all body renderers. Set it to equal a new list of images. And do the same thing for the expression. And now right off the bat, when we first create this character, we retrieve the body renderer and the expression renderer. Now once we get those, we also need to add them to the body renderers and expression renderers lists, because those are supposed to contain all the renderers. So right underneath that, we'll just add them in. Saying renderers.allBodyRenderers.add renderers.activeBodyRenderer, and repeat. Now we can go ahead and start creating the coroutine. So before we do that, as I always do, I'll create a reference for the active coroutine that's going to be used, and we'll need one for the body renderer and expression renderer, but let's handle this one at a time. So I'll call it transitioning body, default set to null, and I'll also want a boolean for is transitioning body, and that will return true if the coroutine is not null. Now a public void transition body, which will either take an integer or a sprite. I'm going to make it easier on myself and just make it take a sprite, because get sprite can take an integer, and I'll just use that whenever I want to get the sprite for this transition. So I want to transition to this sprite at this speed and smooth or not. Who's ever heard of a flout? It's a float. Alright. Again, make a function for stop transitioning body. If we are transitioning, then we need to stop it. Now what's going to be running this coroutine? As you remember, the character is not a mono behavior, meaning it can't run a coroutine on its own. So what we'll actually have to do is use something else to do it. So like we did with movement, we're just going to use the instance of the character manager. Character manager.instance.stop coroutine, because it'll be running on that, and transitioning body. Then after all that transitioning, make sure it is set to null, so that way we know we are not transitioning anymore. So in transition body, stop transitioning body, and then set the instance of the coroutine to equal a new one being used by the character manager. And we're actually going to need a coroutine to pass in there, so let's make that right now. The IEnumerator transitioning body with a capital T, that way it's different from our variable. And that will take in all the variables that we passed into the call method. So a sprite, speed, and smooth. Then up here where we start the coroutine, now we can call transitioning body and pass in all our information. Why is Sprite capitalized there? Now before we actually go trying to transition anything, we need to make sure that our active sprite is not already equal to the intended target. Otherwise we'll be stopping and restarting it for nothing. So if renderers, come on now, if renderers dot body renderer dot sprite equals the sprite, which is our target, then we return, and we don't do anything here. Otherwise we'll stop the current transition, if there is any, and then start a new one. So here we go. In our transition, first off we need to make sure we have the target. So we have a list that tells all of the body renderers associated with this character at this point in time. If any one of those contain the target, then we need to switch that one to the active. So let's just run a simple loop here for int I equals 0 while I is less than renderers dot all body renderers dot count increment. Then image equals renderers dot all body renderers I. So if image dot sprite equals the target sprite, why is that capitalized? There we go. Alright, so if it is equal to our target, then we want to set that as the active. Renderers dot body renderer equals image, and break the loop. So by this point we should either have our target or we should know that we need to create it. How do we know if we need to create it? If the current body renderer does not have that target sprite. So if renderers dot body renderer dot sprite is not equal to sprite, then we know no suitable target was found, and now we need to create one. By default, our character is going to spawn with a body renderer, so all we need to do is duplicate that, and then assign its sprite to this target, and set its alpha to a value of 0, so that way it's invisible at the start and it can transition in. So we'll do that using the instantiate method through the game object, since we are not a mono behavior. I'll get this directly. Say image equals game object dot instantiate renderers dot body renderer dot game object. And then it's important to make sure that we parent it to the body renderer's parent, so that way it's in the same spot, the same position on the map, or on the screen, and attached to the same point on the character. Renderers dot body renderer dot transform dot parent dot get component, because I'm getting this as an image. So now we have the image, we have a newly created object, and we need to add this to all of our renderers and make it the active renderer. So we'll say renderers dot all body renderers dot add image, as well as renderers dot body renderer equals image, because this is now the new active image. So now we know we have our target. So now we need to actually do the transition, and that is going to be called through our global functions. So what we can simply say is well, let me make sure that's static before I go trying to do this. Static bool transition image. Save that. So while global functions dot transition images, I need to reference the active image. So reference renderers dot body renderer. We need all the images now, so reference renderers dot all body renderers. The speed will be the transition speed, which is passed in as that, and then whether we smooth or not. So while we transition, we will yield until the end of the frame. And then after all that is done, our transition is finished, and we can stop transitioning the body. So now, let's go into global functions and make this work. So here we go. Now the way this works is we need to loop through each one, but we can't start at the beginning. We need to start at the end of the list and work our way forward. Because once an object reaches an alpha of 0, we want to destroy it. And if we destroy something while we're incrementing the index, then we may reach a point where we come to an out of range exception. However, if we're doing the exact opposite, working from the end, going back to the beginning, we won't run into that issue. So, instead of starting at 0, we'll make our integer I equal to all images dot count minus 1. So while I is greater than or equal to 0, decrement. And we know we're going to be using speed, which is going to be multiplied by time.delta time. So rather than do that for each frame, or each object, rather, I'm just going to say speed times equals time.delta time. Do that right off the bat. And now, image equals all images I. We don't want to transition out our active image, we want to transition that in. So we need to make sure that the one that we're working on isn't the active image. If it is, then we need to fade in. If not, fade out. If image equals active image, else, I don't know about you guys, but I don't like the code having it go back on me like that. I know it's trying to save space or whatever reason, but I prefer my order like that. I don't know why, I just like it better that way. Kind of grates my nerves a little bit, but let's not get on that. So now the way we need to change the alpha of any image, we're going to be affecting the color, but we can't do that changing any single value within a color. We need to change the entire thing itself, which is a little bit of a pain, but it's not that bad. So let's go ahead and make a function for that, since we know we're going to be using that a lot. So public static color, will be returning a new color, set alpha. And we'll pass in the color we want to change, and then whatever the alpha is we want to set it to. Return new color, and the first three values will just be the color values, for R, G, B, and then the final will be our alpha. There we go, so set alpha. Now, here's where we do it. Image dot color equals set alpha image dot color, and for the alpha we're going to want this to be a transition, a gradual transition. We don't want to go straight to 0, so what we'll be doing, this is where our smooth comes in. If we smooth, then we're going to be lerping. We'll use mathf.lerp to change the integer, or change the float rather, from the current value down towards 0 by our speed. That would be image.color.a. Boy, that does not want to work with me right now. Let me go ahead and make my little space there. So lerp from the current value. If it's active, remember this is the active image, so we want to change it to a value of 1, or total transparency, or opaqueness rather. And the speed of that will be our speed. On the other hand, if we are not smoothing, then we'll be using mathf.moveTowards. Again, image.color alpha, be moving towards 1 at our speed. And if this happens, we know what? A value has changed. So our return value should now be true. And now let's do the same for the bottom. Otherwise, except this is an inactive image, so what we need to do is change 1 to 0. So that way this fades out. And after all of that, right here, if that image, the inactive one, if its alpha is 0, then we should destroy the object. But we can't just destroy it, we need to remove it from the renderer list. So all images dot remove at I. And then destroy immediate image dot game object. And continue to the next item. And that should handle the transition just fine. Back in character, where we have come to create the renderer, down here, if we don't have our target and we need to create a new one, we want to make sure the alpha is 0, so that way it's not immediately visible once we spawn in our new target. So we'll just say image.color equals global functions.set alpha image.color 0f. There, so when we spawn it in, it's going to be invisible. Now let's go into character testing, and where I go to change the body, if I hold down the key T, then I want to make it transition instead. By calling Raylene.transitionBody Raylene.getSprite body index. The speed I'm going to make float speed something like 5. Look bool smooth transitions equals false right off the bat. And now let's look at this transition. Oh, look at this. Alright, character, so error, only assignment call. Alright, so we have an error here. Let's check that out real quick, see what that's all about. Bool is transitioning. Aha, yes, I need to make sure I return that value. And then I also saw something in global F about returning can't convert a Boolean to a float. What was that about? Line 26. If image.color A, okay. If image.color A equals 0, if the alpha of the object we're trying to fade out is at 0, then it has faded out and we need to destroy it. So there we go. And now we can come in and actually check this out. Alright, there we are. Now the body index I'm going to make 3, so that way she'll have her fingers co-joined. The speed, set that to 1 right off the bat. We will make it smooth. Now I'm holding down T, I'm going to press B, and there we go. We have now transitioned the body. But would you look at that? The body is overlaying the expression. That's not something we really want, is it? So let's take a look at Raylene and figure out why that is. If we come into panel characters, which is where she's resting, we have character Raylene, body layer, expression layer, body layer clone. Body layer is on top of the expression layer, which is why it's rendering on top of it in the screen. If I were to drag that and place it underneath expression, then it renders how we would want it. Now, it looks like I used the wrong layer there, and body layer is actually not being destroyed. So we have ourselves a little something to work with here. Let me exit out. First off, let's address the issue of having those items spawn in the correct order. So let me come to Raylene's prefab, and just spawn her into the scene. And now, where we have the body layer and expression layer, what I'm going to do is duplicate the expression layer, or the body layer rather, and then just name it. This is actually going to be the body layer, and this is going to be called, I'm going to change its name to body renderer. And the body renderer is going to be attached to the body layer inside of the character. And we'll do the same thing for the expressions. And make sure the layers do not have any image components attached to them. Now, because I've changed the names of those, I need to come back to my character script and make sure that my script will still work with them. Where I go to find the body renderer, have ob.transform.find body layer. So that's trying to find a child there, which is actually a capital B and a capital E. Get component, but that's no longer the item that has it. It's going to be its child. So get component in children. Get component in children. And now that'll work just fine. So let's come back in. I still realize those items. Oh wait, hang on. Actually want to save that as a new prefab then, overriding the old one. And now I'll get rid of her from the scene. Alright, so what is an image that I can change this to? She's going to cross her arms, and that is index 1. Okay, so index 3 is actually the one I was going for earlier. Tester, body index 3, make it something like 2, it's going to be smooth, and now let's transition. I believe I know what the problem is. This would be called an ID10T error. So where we go here, up here, where we create it, renderers, .body renderer. See, I set the color of the new image, but I never set the sprite of it. It's still using the same sprite. Image.sprite equals sprite. And now if we come in and hit B, she transitions to the right thing this time. And you can see it transitions underneath the expression layer because we're using that body layer as we should have. Now, the other thing is this body renderer is not being destroyed. Why is that? The alpha is at 0, we see that, but it's not being destroyed. So let's check out why that. Alright, so by default, the way we have this set up, any value changed is always going to be taking place, since this is a loop that's just going through to check them, but anytime it even checks the item, it assumes that the color is not set to the value we need it to be, and it says any value has changed. Instead, what we need to do is check the color, or check the alpha of this color, and make sure it's not already at the target, either 1 or 0. So for the active image, if image.color.a is less than 1f, then we're going to move or lerp the value, and then say any value changed is true. Same with down here. If image.color.a is greater than 0, then we're going to change the value. And I can change this if statement to an else. And as it turns out, there's actually no problem with the transition here. The reason that the body layer shows up for a very long time is just because we were on smooth transition, which was using lerp, which takes a very, very long time at the very end to reach the actual value. It's good visible up until a certain point where it really slows down to the point of if it went any slower, it'd be going backwards. So when we use smooth transition, you're not going to see what's fading out, but it's still going to be there for a little while after it becomes invisible to the naked eye. However, with just moving non-smooth, it pretty much goes away very quickly. Now again, using lerp isn't going to be detrimental in any way because you're not going to see any of those images that'll still be there because their alpha value will still be low enough that they don't really render on the screen. So there's our transition for the body, and all we really have to do is duplicate what we just did for the expression. And we don't even have to duplicate the transitioning portion because all we have to do is just use global function and then reference the different values for that. So I don't even need to show you guys how to do this, so I'll just run through this real quickly, speed it up, and we'll get to the next section here in just a moment. And finally, the end result after all of that is a smooth transitioning for both our body as well as the expression without affecting the body. Just like that. And now, going back to what I said before, if this is pretty much the end of the video, but I'm just going to address something that I made mention of very earlier, the very beginning of the video. If you don't have a split character, and instead you have all of these sprites as individual textures, and import them as sprites, let's show how we can just load those instead. So I come into characters, and then I'll paste something else that I'm going to import as a sprite. Let's say that this is a sprite for a certain character, which is actually Corin from Fire Emblem. So import it as a sprite, apply. So there we are. I'm going to rename this to Corin. And if I want to load Corin's normal sprite, let's say this is just normal. So I would actually call it Corin normal. And then inside of our character, where we get the sprite, instead of loading everything as an array, what we would do is something a little different. So this is very similar to what we already did. We just say sprite equals resources.load, not load all, but load sprite, followed by the path, which would be images, characters, and then here's where we would add the name of the text we want to do. So instead of an index, I would be passing in a name like normal, and if the character's name was Corin, then I would say plus character name, plus underscore, plus the emotion name, which would be normal. But since I already know all of that, I'm just going to pass it in manually, Corin normal. Then return sprite. So if we were to do it that, then what would wind up happening is we would just load that single image as the texture, just like that. Alternatively, since I have Raylene here who has a whole bunch of sprites and I may not care to memorize or go back and look to see what index is what image, then if all characters are going to be using the same things, so index 0 for every character would be this type of normal pose, index 2 would always be an angle pose for that character, then I could associate an index with a name value. So coming into my character manager, down where I have character positions, which we used for movement, I could say public class character expressions. Public int normal, the normal expression would equal 0. Public int the shy expression would equal 1. So then in character settings, where I transition body, I could actually Raylene.getSprite, instead of passing in an index, maybe character manager dot character expressions, which it would have to be static, public static character expressions equals new character expressions. Character expressions dot cojoined fingers. And that would be the same as saying get sprite of index 3, only this time I have a name that I can actually say, okay, that is this, and I don't have to go back to the file and look at it. So now when I transition the body, it'll load cojoined fingers, which really means index 3. So now I have a name to go with my indexes. So that concludes this episode. In the next video, we'll actually be looking at transitioning backgrounds and foregrounds. That's going to be very quick, and you guys actually could go ahead and do that yourselves, because all we'll be doing is using the global functions transitioning images, doing pretty much exactly what we did with the characters, only for the background and foreground. So we'll be adding a few layers into the canvas, but other than that, it's going to be for a very quick video. So I will see you guys next time, and until then, enjoy yourselves.